In the high places where the air grows thin and the world falls away beneath layers of cloud, there exists a particular kind of magic, the magic of the mountain cabin. These sanctuaries have drawn wanderers for centuries, offering refuge in landscapes where nature still holds dominion. Let us begin our journey into the heart of Alpine comfort, where stone, timber, and flame create a home against the wilderness. The tradition of mountain cabins traces back over 1,000 years in the Alps, where shepherds first built simple stone huts called Sennhauten to shelter during summer grazing seasons. These humble structures, tucked into meadows at elevations above 5,000 feet, were never meant to be permanent homes. They were seasonal dwellings, places to craft cheese and butter while livestock fed on the sweet mountain grasses. Yet in their simplicity, they established something profound, the idea that humans could carve out warmth and belonging in the most unforgiving terrain. As we climb higher into our story, we encounter the fog, that ethereal companion of mountain mornings. Alpine fog forms when warm, moist air rises up mountain slopes and cools rapidly, condensing into droplets that cling to the landscape like a living breath. This phenomenon, called orographic fog, can reduce visibility to mere feet, transforming familiar trails into dreamscapes. But inside the cabin, watching fog press against the windows like curious spirits, there is a particular coziness, a feeling of being suspended between earth and sky, present yet hidden from the world below. The heart of any mountain cabin is, and has always been, the hearth. In traditional Alpine architecture, the Kachelofen, a ceramic tile stove, served as the central heating source, often rising from floor to ceiling in a tower of green or cream-colored glazed tiles. These magnificent structures weren't merely functional. They were thermal batteries, absorbing heat from wood fires and radiating it slowly, evenly throughout the long mountain nights. A well-built Kachelofen could keep a cabin warm for 12 to 18 hours after the fire had died to embers, requiring only 2 loads of wood per day, even in the depths of winter. In the folklore of mountain peoples, cabins held protective powers. Swiss and Austrian traditions speak of the Alm de Fee, the wise hermit of the high pastures who knew the language of wind and stone. These solitary figures, living season after season in isolated cabins, were believed to possess special knowledge, which herbs could heal, when avalanches would fall, and how to read the future in the patterns of morning frost. They were intermediaries between the human world below and the realm of peaks above, and their cabins were considered threshold spaces, neither fully wild nor fully tamed. The timber used in traditional cabin construction tells its own story. Mountain builders preferred larch and Swiss stone pine, woods that grow slowly at high elevations, developing tight grain and natural resistance to rot and insects. A cabin built from 100-year-old pine, each log carefully notched and fitted, could stand for 300 years or more, weathering to a silver gray that blends seamlessly with the rocky landscape. The scent of stone pine warm, vanilla sweet with hints of resin, naturally permeates these cabins, creating an aromatherapy that mountaineers have cherished for generations. As evening approaches in our mountain sanctuary, the phenomenon locals call Blaustund, the blue hour, transforms the world outside. This is the time just after sunset when the sky deepens to an intense, saturated blue, and fog in the valleys below begins to glow with reflected twilight. Mountain dwellers have long considered this the most magical hour, when the boundary between day and night becomes permeable, and the cabin's warm light against the deepening cold seems most precious. Inside, as darkness gathers, we tend the fire. The ritual of building a hearth fire follows patterns established by necessity and perfected over centuries. Kindling arranged in a small pyramid, larger splits laid in a crisscross pattern to allow oxygen flow, and always the chimney damper opened first. There's an old Alpine saying, "Ein goats fewer wormed sie a mile." A good fire warms twice, once when you chop the wood, and once when you burn it. This practical wisdom speaks to the physical investment mountain living requires, but also to the deep satisfaction found in self-sufficiency. The sounds of a cabin evening form their own symphony. The pop and crackle of burning wood caused by pockets of moisture and resin expanding and bursting creates a rhythm as old as human consciousness. Outside, if you listen carefully, you might hear the particular silence that comes with fog, a dense quiet that absorbs and muffles, broken only by the occasional drip of condensation from eaves. Each drop a small percussion marking time in this suspended world. As our first 10 minutes in this mountain refuge draw to a close, we settle into the profound comfort that only altitude and isolation can provide, a comfort not of convenience, but of elemental simplicity. Here, surrounded by ancient wood and stone, wrapped in fog and firelight, we remember what it means to be warm, to be sheltered, to be home. As we settle deeper into our mountain evening, the cabin reveals its layered history through details that speak of generations past. The windows of traditional Alpine cabins were deliberately small, not from lack of craftsmanship, but from hard-won wisdom. At elevations above 6,000 feet, where winter temperatures can plummet to 20 below zero, each square foot of glass represents a significant heat loss. Yet these small windows, often no larger than 2 feet across, frame the mountain landscape like living paintings, making each glimpse of peak or forest feel precious, curated by the very architecture that protects us. The fog outside has thickened now, and with it comes a phenomenon that mountain folk have observed for centuries, the absolute stillness. Unlike the restless mists of lowland valleys, alpine fog often settles with remarkable calm, particularly in the evening hours when temperature inversions trap it in place. This creates what meteorologists call a stable air mass, a pocket of tranquility where the air barely moves and sounds carry in strange muffled ways. From inside our cabin, the world beyond the windows seems to have paused, holding its breath. Let us turn our attention to the floor beneath our feet. In authentic mountain caverns, wide plank flooring was hewn from single trees, often measuring 16 to 20 inches across, trees that had grown for 200 years or more before being felled. These planks were laid with small gaps between them, a seemingly counterintuitive choice that actually served a purpose. The gaps allowed air circulation beneath the floor, preventing moisture accumulation and rot in a climate where snow might press against the cabin's foundation for 6 months of the year. Walk across such a floor and it speaks, a gentle creaking, that becomes the cabin's voice, announcing your movements, reminding you that this is a living structure, expanding and contracting with the seasons. The tradition of the stube, the main living room, centered around the hearth, reflects a profound understanding of mountain psychology. In regions where winter darkness lasts 16 hours a day, and isolation could stretch for weeks during heavy snows, cabin builders created spaces that encouraged gathering, conversation, and the preservation of sanity through community. Even in the smallest cabins, the stube received the most attention. Carved wooden paneling called fir, built-in benches positioned to capture the stove's heat, and often a corner bench, the hairgut swinkle, or God's corner, placed diagonally to symbolize the divine presence in daily life. This wasn't merely religious sentiment. It was recognition that in the high mountains, humility and reverence helped humans survive. Outside, the fog performs another of its nightly rituals. As temperatures continue to drop, tiny ice crystals begin forming on every exposed surface, a process called frost deposition. By morning, the entire world will be transformed into a crystal garden. Every pine needle outlined in white, every spiderweb transformed into jewelry. But we're warm inside, and this is part of the cabin's essential gift, the ability to witness winter's severity from a position of safety, to appreciate its terrible beauty without suffering its consequences. The smell of wood smoke now permeates everything as it should. In mountain cultures, the scent of smoke was once considered a measure of a home's vitality. A cabin without smoke was a cabin without life, cold, abandoned, possibly dangerous to enter after months of emptiness. Different woods produce different smokes. Larch burns hot and clean with a faintly sweet edge. Spruce crackles and pops with a sharper, resinous character, while the prized stone pine releases an aroma that's almost incense-like, believed by Alpine dwellers to have medicinal properties that clear the lungs and calm the mind. Modern studies have actually confirmed that Swiss stone pine contains pinoselvium, a compound with mild antimicrobial properties and a demonstrable effect on heart rate, lowering it by an average of 3,500 beats per day, roughly an hour's worth of cardiac work saved simply by sleeping in a room lined with this ancient wood. As night deepens, we might light a candle, and here too, mountain tradition offers wisdom. The old cabin keepers favored beeswax candles over tallow, not just for their cleaner burn, but because bees that forage on alpine flowers produce wax with a higher melting point, making candles that stand up better to the dry heat radiating from the ceramic stoves. A beeswax candle also releases negative ions as it burns, which can reduce airborne particles and create what some describe as a freshening effect in closed mountain cabins where air circulation is limited by design. There is an old Alpine custom called Stubenwarmen, the warming of the room, a ritual performed when a cabin has stood empty. Before settling in for the evening, you move systematically through the space, opening cupboards, touching walls, essentially reacquainting yourself with every corner and surface. This wasn't superstition, it was practical wisdom. An unattended cabin could harbor broken shutters, animal nests in chimneys, or moisture damage that needed addressing. But it was also psychological, a way of reclaiming the space, making it yours again. transforming it from a cold structure into a living home. The hours between 8 and 10 in the evening have always been considered the sweetest in mountain cabin life. The day's work, whether chopping wood, hauling water, or simply hiking to reach this refuge, is behind you. The night stretches ahead, long enough for rest, but not yet demanding it. This is the time for stories, for reading by firelight, for the kind of unhurried thought that only seems possible when you're disconnected from the rushing world below. The fog presses close, the fire murmurs its ancient language, and time itself seems to slow, moving at the pace of burning wood and settling embers. As we complete this second passage through our mountain evening, we find ourselves not merely warm, but held embraced by timber and stone, protected by traditions refined across centuries, guests in a lineage of refuge that stretches back into the mists of human memory. The night has fully arrived now, and with it comes a quality of darkness that lowland dwellers rarely experience. At high altitude, far from the ambient glow of cities and towns, darkness is not merely the absence of light, it is a presence unto itself, thick and complete. Yet inside our cabin this darkness becomes a gift, making the firelight seem warmer, the shadows deeper and more comforting. Each flame-cast flicker on the wooden walls, a small performance that has captivated humans since we first learned to contain fire within four walls. Let us consider the roof above our heads, for it too tells a story of mountain ingenuity. Traditional Alpine cabins employed shingled roofs made of wooden shingles, split by hand from blocks of larch or spruce. These shingles, each about 18 inches long and tapering from thick to thin, were never nailed flat, but instead weighted down with stones. This technique, which appears precarious to modern eyes, actually allows the roof to breathe and shift with the tremendous weight of winter snow, sometimes 6 feet deep or more. A rigid roof would crack and fail under such pressure, but these weighted shingles move as a collective entity, distributing the load while allowing moisture to escape. Some of these roofs have shed snow for 300 winters without replacement. In the corner near the stove you might notice a stack of split wood arranged with particular care. This is no accident. Experienced mountain dwellers practice what's known as holes ladgering, the art of wood storage, with near religious devotion. Wood must be stacked bark side up to shed moisture, with spaces between pieces for air circulation, and always enough brought inside to reach room temperature before burning. Cold wood burns inefficiently, producing more creosote and less heat. The old-timers say you should bring in tomorrow's wood tonight, allowing the logs to warm while you sleep, so they're ready to give their full energy when called upon. It's a small practice, but one that speaks to the careful resource management that mountain survival demands. Outside, though we cannot see it through the fog, the mountain itself is alive with subtle movement. Winter fog in alpine regions often contains supercooled water droplets, liquid water that remains unfrozen even at temperatures several degrees below freezing. When these droplets touch any solid surface, they freeze instantly, building up layers of rime ice that can grow into fantastic structures, sometimes extending 2 or 3 feet into the wind. By morning, the cabin itself may be transformed, its windward side armored in crystalline formations that make it look like a structure from a fairy tale. but we are inside, warm and dry, and this transformation happens without us, the mountain decorating itself while we rest. The water we drink here tastes different from any other water in the world. Mountain springs, filtered through layers of granite and limestone, emerge cold and mineral-rich, often carrying trace elements of the very mountains themselves. In traditional cabin locations, a spring was not merely convenient, it was essential. Cabins were sited near reliable water sources, and these springs were often marked by small shrines or carved stones, acknowledgments that water, more than anything else, made human habitation possible at these heights. The taste of this water-clean, slightly metallic, alive with cold, becomes part of the mountain experience. So distinct that those who've spent time in Alpine cabins can recognize it years later. A flavor memory as powerful as any sight or sound. As we tend the fire once more, adding another log to the glowing bed of coals, we participate in a ritual unchanged for millennia. But the fire itself is more complex than it appears. Wood doesn't simply burn, it undergoes pyrolysis, a process where heat breaks down the solid wood into gases that then ignite and flame. What we see as fire is actually these gases burning, not the wood itself. The wood chars and becomes coal, which then burns at a lower, steadier temperature. Understanding this process, mountain dwellers learned to manage their fires with precision. Hot flames in the evening when heat is needed quickly. Then banked coals through the night for sustained, gentle warmth. A well-managed fire could burn for 24 hours on a single armload of wood, providing the coals to restart the next day's fire without matches or flint. The isolation of mountain cabins once meant that residents developed what anthropologists call material intimacia, profound knowledge of every object in their possession. In a place where replacement was impossible and each item had to be carried up on foot or by pack animal, nothing was disposable. The iron poker by the hearth might be 200 years old, its handle worn smooth by generations of hands. The copper kettle hanging from its hook could be even older, its bottom darkened by countless fires. Small dents telling stories of dropped loads and hasty rescues. These objects weren't merely tools. They were companions, their presence as familiar and comforting as the cabin itself. There's a particular meditation that comes with watching fog through a cabin window at night. Unlike rain, which announces itself with sound and movement, fog simply is patient, pervasive, transforming visibility into intimacy. The Japanese have a word, igen, that captures something of this quality. A profound awareness of the universe that triggers emotional responses too deep for words. Sitting in a mountain cabin, wrapped in firelight while fog erases the world beyond your windows, you experience something similar, a sense of being held in a moment outside normal time, where past and present and future all exist in the same eternal now. The Germans have another term worth knowing, gemütlichkeit, a word that combines coziness, peace, and a sense of belonging, but goes deeper than any of these alone. It's the feeling you get in a space that welcomes you completely, where you can be utterly yourself, where warmth and safety aren't just physical conditions but emotional states. Mountain cabins, perhaps more than any other human dwelling, cultivate Gemütlichkeit. Every element, from the heat radiating from ancient ceramic tiles to the way fog presses against small windows, conspires to create this feeling of absolute sanctuary. As this third portion of our evening draws to a close, we find ourselves not just in a cabin, but in a state of mind. The mountain darkness, the embracing fog, the steady warmth of the fire, all of these have worked their subtle magic, slowing our breathing, quieting our thoughts, returning us to a more fundamental way of being. Here, in this wooden refuge perched between earth and sky, we remember that humans are small, that shelter is precious, and that there is a particular kind of wealth that has nothing to do with abundance and everything to do with enough. As the night deepens beyond the halfway point of our journey, we become aware of the cabin's soundscape, not silence. Exactly, but a symphony of small, purposeful noises that mark the passage of time in this elevated world. The stove ticks and pings as metal expands and contracts with the fire's heat, a sound that mountain dwellers call da singandeo fans, the singing of the stove. This metallic music, far from being jarring, becomes deeply soothing, a lullaby that has rocked generations of mountain children to sleep. Each tick represents a tiny shift in temperature, the stove finding its equilibrium, doing its patient work of transforming wood into warmth. The chairs and benches in traditional Alpine cabins were positioned with scientific precision, though those who built them might not have thought of it that way. Seating was placed at specific distances from the stove, close enough to benefit from radiant heat, but far enough to avoid the discomfort of direct exposure. This distance, usually between 6 and 8 feet, creates what heating engineers now call the comfort zone, where radiant heat combines with convective air currents to warm the human body most efficiently. The old builders knew this instinctively through generations of trial and observation, creating spaces where you could sit for hours without ever feeling too hot or too cold, just perfectly contentedly warm. Let us speak now of the art of roche fang, the smoke capture that makes cabin life possible. The chimney of a mountain cabin is not merely a tube for venting smoke. It's a carefully engineered system that creates draw-through temperature differential. Hot gases rise through the chimney, creating negative pressure inside that pulls fresh air into the fire through carefully placed vents. In the finest examples of Alpine construction, chimneys were built with internal chambers that slowed the smoke's exit, allowing the masonry to absorb more heat before releasing the gases to the outside air. These massive chimneys, sometimes weighing several tons, acted as thermal masses, storing warmth and releasing it slowly, continuing to heat the cabin hours after the fire had gone out. Outside, the fog may be performing one of its most remarkable transformations. On nights when temperatures hover just around freezing, fog droplets can exist in what's called a supercooled state, remaining liquid below 32 degrees Fahrenheit. When these droplets encounter the slightest disturbance, a gust of wind, a falling pine cone, even the wing beat of a night bird, they can freeze almost instantaneously, creating a sound like the tiniest whisper of breaking glass. Mountain guides call this flies or feign ice, and it signals a particular kind of night, one where morning will reveal a landscape completely transformed, every surface encased in a shell of crystal. The bedding in a mountain cabin tells its own story of adaptation to extreme conditions. Traditional Alpine beds were built as enclosed boxes, Epstein, with wooden sides and sometimes even partial canopies. This wasn't for privacy in the modern sense, but for survival. These box beds created microclimates, trapping body heat and breath in a smaller space than the room at large. Inside such a bed, piled with wool blankets and down comforters called featherbetten, a person could sleep comfortably even when the cabin's interior temperature dropped to near freezing. The eider eiderdown from wild ducks was particularly prized, as it provides exceptional insulation while remaining remarkably light, a handful of feathers creating a quilt that could keep you warm at temperatures well below zero. There's a practice in mountain cabin keeping called Nachthol's Night Wood, the selection and preparation of the specific logs you'll burn during the sleeping hours. These aren't ordinary pieces. They're chosen for their density and their ability to burn slowly and steadily. Hardwoods like beech or oak, or the dense heartwood of ancient pines, are split to a specific size, thick enough to burn for hours, but not so large they can't ignite properly from the bed of coals. A well-chosen piece of nightwood, placed carefully on glowing embers before sleep, will burn through until dawn, keeping the cabin warm through the coldest hours without any human attention. This is the kind of knowledge that kept people alive, passed down through observation and necessity, refined across countless winter nights. The fog outside continues its patient work, and with it comes a phenomenon that few experience but mountain dwellers know well: acoustic deadening. Fog absorbs sound waves, particularly higher frequencies, creating an effect where distant sounds simply vanish, while near sounds become preternaturally clear. Inside the cabin, this means that the crackle of the fire, the tick of the stove, even your own breathing, all seem amplified, more present, while the outside world falls into muffled absence. It's as if the cabin becomes its own universe, complete and self-contained, unconnected to anything beyond its walls. In the dim light, you might notice the way shadows pool in the corners of the room, thick and soft as velvet. Before electric light, humans lived most of their lives in partial darkness, and mountain cabins preserve this ancient relationship with shadow longer than most dwellings. Firelight and candlelight don't eliminate darkness, they negotiate with it, creating pockets of visibility while leaving much in gentle obscurity. This half-light is actually easier on human eyes and more conducive to the production of melatonin, the hormone that regulates sleep. Modern sleep science has confirmed what mountain dwellers always knew. The gradual dimming of natural firelight prepares the body for rest far more effectively than the harsh transition from electric brightness to sudden darkness. There is a German concept called Wardensamkeit, the feeling of solitude and contemplation one experiences in the forest. But in a mountain cabin at night, surrounded by fog, we might speak instead of Huttensamkeit, cabin solitude. This is not loneliness, but rather a profound sense of self-sufficiency and peace. You are alone, yes, but you are also enough. The cabin is enough. The fire is enough. The foregrap's night is enough. This completeness, this lack of want or need for anything beyond what's immediately present, is perhaps the deepest gift that mountain refuge offers, a temporary release from the endless striving and accumulation that marks modern life, a return to the elemental satisfaction of warmth, shelter, and being. As we approach the end of this segment, the fire has burned down to a glowing bed of coals, each ember pulsing with stored sunlight released slowly across the hours. The fog presses close against our small windows like a living thing, curious but ultimately indifferent to the warm-blooded creatures sheltering within these wooden walls. We are suspended in time and space, neither fully of the mountain nor fully separate from it, held in that perfect balance that is the essence of the cabin experience. We have reached the deepest part of the night, that hour when the world seems to hold its breath before the slow turn toward morning. The fire has settled into its rhythm of coals, and we find ourselves in what the old mountain folk called Die Herstand, the heart hour, that time between waking and sleeping, when the mind drifts freely and the boundary between dream and thought becomes permeable. It is in these hours that the cabin reveals its most intimate secrets. The whispers of all those who have sheltered here before us dot the construction of a traditional mountain cabin followed principles that modern architects are only now rediscovering. Logs were never cut in spring or summer, but only during the winter month, the winter moon, when sap had retreated deep into the roots and the wood was at its driest and most stable. These winter-cut logs, felled during the waning moon according to ancient practice, contained less moisture and were less prone to cracking and warping as they aged. Foresters would mark trees years in advance, watching them through seasons, knowing which ones had the straight grain and slow growth rings that would make them ideal for construction. A cabin built from such carefully selected timber could stand for 500 years, each log settling into its neighbors with such precision that no chinking was needed between them. Outside, the fog has reached what meteorologists call saturation equilibrium, a state where the air holds exactly as much moisture as it can at the current temperature, neither gaining nor losing, simply existing in perfect balance. In this state, fog becomes almost tangible, thick enough that if you were to step outside you could feel it on your skin like the gentlest touch, cool and slightly adhesive. Mountain climbers describe walking through such fog as moving through a cloud from the inside, which is, of course, exactly what it is, for clouds and fog are the same phenomena, differing only in whether they touch the ground or float above it. Let us turn our attention to the art of offensive Zen, the setting of the stovercraft, that was once considered as important as blacksmithing or carpentry in Alpine communities. A master stove setter would spend weeks on a single installation, carefully constructing the internal maze of chambers and passages that would extract maximum heat from the burning wood. Let us turn our attention to the art of offensives, the setting of the stovercraft, that was once considered as important as blacksmithing or carpentry in Alpine communities. A master stove setter would spend weeks on a single installation, carefully constructing the internal maze of chambers and passages that would extract maximum heat from the burning wood. The best ceramic stoves contained up to 7 separate chambers, forcing the hot gases to travel through a winding path before exiting through the chimney. This meant that smoke might spend several minutes inside the stove, giving up nearly all its heat to the ceramic mass before escaping. A stove built by a true master could heat a cabin for 18 hours on a single load of wood, and families would save for years to afford such craftsmanship. The small shelf near the stove, present in nearly every traditional cabin, served a purpose both practical and profound. Called the trocken board or drying board, this shelf, positioned in the warm air rising from the stove, was where wet mittens and socks could dry overnight. where herbs gathered in summer meadows were preserved for winter use, where bread dough was set to rise in the gentle warmth. But it also became a kind of altar to daily life, a place where the essential and the cherished mingled. A tin cup, a carved wooden spoon, perhaps a small figure whittled during long winter evenings. These objects, warmed by the stove's proximity, seemed to take on a life of their own, blessed by the same heat that sustained human life. In the deepest cold of mountain winters, a phenomenon occurs that the old-timers called house breath. When the interior of the cabin is warm and the outside air plunges far below freezing, any small gap or imperfection in the structure becomes visible as a thin stream of vapor. The cabin's warm, moist air meeting the frigid night and condensing into visible breath. These tiny streams of vapor reveal the cabin as a living thing, breathing out the warmth created by fire and human presence in constant exchange with the mountain air. Master builders could read these patterns, knowing where to add insulation, where to adjust ventilation. Treating the cabin as a physician treats a patient, observing symptoms and applying remedies. The particular quality of sleep that comes in a mountain cabin has been noted by travelers and poets for centuries. There's a physiological explanation. At elevation is between 4,000 and 7,000 feet. The air contains less oxygen, prompting the body to breathe more deeply and slowly. Combined with the gentle, radiant heat from a ceramic stove, the slight hypoxia produces what climbers call Heilschlafaltitude sleep, a rest that feels deeper and more restorative than ordinary slumber. Dreams in this state often have unusual clarity and vividness, and many report waking with solutions to problems that seemed intractable the evening before. The mountain, it seems, not only shelters the body, but clarifies the mind. The fog outside performs yet another of its nightly transformations. As the temperature continues to drop toward its pre-dawn minimum, the fog may begin to settle, its lower layers growing denser while the upper portions thin and dissipate. This creates what's called nebel, a sea of fog where the cabin, if positioned at the right elevation, might emerge above the cloud layer like an island. Come morning we might wake to find ourselves floating in a sea of white, with only the highest peaks visible as distant islands in an ocean of mist. But that revelation waits for dawn. For now we remain wrapped in the fog's embrace, unable to see beyond our small sphere of warmth and light. There is an old Alpine tradition of speaking to the cabin before sleep, a practice that might seem like superstition, but contains deeper wisdom. Danke, Hut, Fardeen Schutz, thank you, cabin, for your protection. This acknowledgment served multiple purposes. It was a moment of genuine gratitude, a recognition that shelter is never guaranteed and always precious. But it was also a final mental inventory, a last check that all was secure, fire properly banked. Door latched, shutters closed, water brought in so it wouldn't freeze. Speaking to the cabin made these checks into a ritual rather than a chore, transforming practical necessity into something approaching prayer. As this segment of our night draws to a close, we prepare for sleep in the traditional way. One last log added to the glowing coals, chosen carefully for its density and staying power. A final glance at the windows to see the fog still pressed close, intimate and protective. The gradual dimming of consciousness that comes naturally here. without the need for screens or pills or white noise machines, just the ancient rhythm of fire and darkness, warmth and cold, shelter and wilderness. The cabin holds us as we drift towards sleep, this small wooden sanctuary that has held so many others through so many nights, adding our rest to the accumulated peace of centuries. We drift now through the hours of deepest night, that timeless space between midnight and dawn when even the fog seems to sleep. The cabin breathes around us in gentle creaks and sighs, the wood contracting in the cold, the stove radiating its patient warmth. In traditional Alpine belief, these are the hours when the mountain itself dreams, and those sheltering within its embrace can sometimes share those dreams, visions of stone and ice and the slow passage of geological time. The placement of windows in a mountain cabin was never arbitrary, but followed an ancient wisdom called Himmelsrichtung, the cardinal directions principle. Windows facing east were sized to capture the first light of dawn, psychologically crucial during long winters when daylight might last only 6 or 7 hours. South-facing windows were largest, positioned to maximize the warming power of the winter sun, which at high altitudes shines with particular intensity even in the coldest months. West windows remain small, protecting against afternoon winds that often rise in mountain terrain. And north-facing walls, where possible, had no windows at all, the north being the source of the fiercest cold and the driving snows that could last for days. This orientation wasn't written in books, but lived in the bodies of builders who understood the mountain's moods through lifetimes of observation. In the darkness, the stove continues its work, and within its ceramic core a process unfolds that connects us to ancient alchemy. The tiles of a traditional Kachelofen are made from a specific type of clay found in Alpine valleys, mixed with sand and fired at temperatures exceeding 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. This firing process creates a material that's both porous enough to absorb heat and dense enough to retain it. Perfect thermal mediator. The glaze applied to these tiles often contains metallic oxides that give the distinctive green, cream or brown colors, but these aren't merely decorative. Different glazes have different thermal properties, and master craftsmen chose their colors based on the specific heating needs of each room, creating stoves that were functional sculptures, each one unique. The fog outside has entered what mountain meteorologists call its Ruhephase resting phase, between the hours of 2 and 5 in the morning. When temperatures reach their lowest point and air movement stills almost completely, fog often becomes perfectly static, neither rising nor falling, neither thickening nor dispersing. In this state, it creates a kind of suspended animation, preserving whatever temperature and moisture conditions exist. Cabins wrapped in such fog experience remarkably stable temperatures, the fog acting as an insulating blanket that prevents heat from radiating away into the clear night sky. It's one of nature's paradoxes. The fog that seems cold and damp actually helps keep the cabin warm. There is a tradition in some Alpine regions called Mitternachts, bread night bread, though the practice has mostly faded now. In cabins where people worked through portions of the night, cheesemakers tending their curds, shepherds during lambing season, or simply families on the longest winter nights, a small meal would be taken in the deepest dark. Not a full supper, but perhaps a slice of dense mountain bread with butter and cheese, eaten slowly by firelight. This wasn't merely about hunger. It was about marking the passage of the night, about giving shape and rhythm to the darkness, about affirming that even in the coldest, most isolated hours there was sustenance and comfort to be found. The bread eaten at midnight, they said, tasted different, quieter somehow, more substantial, as if the darkness itself added weight and meaning to the simple act of eating. The wooden walls around us contain their own history, readable to those who know how to look. Each plank and beam bears the marks of the tools that shaped it, the regular scalloped pattern of the bright bile, the broad axe used to hew logs into timbers, or the finer lines of the zagmiasa, the draw knife that smooths surfaces. These tool marks aren't imperfections, but rather signatures, evidence of human hands and human skill. In the half-light of the dying fire, running your fingers along these marks, you can almost feel the presence of the builder, the rhythm of their work, the care they took in creating shelter that would outlast them by centuries. Modern lumber, cut by machine, lacks this intimate record of creation. It's smooth and uniform and somehow anonymous. But these walls remember the hands that made them. Sleep at altitude brings with it a phenomenon that researchers call periodic breathing, a pattern where respiration becomes irregular, speeding up and slowing down in gentle cycles throughout the night. This is the body's way of adjusting to lower oxygen levels, and while it might sound concerning, it's actually perfectly normal and even beneficial. The deeper breaths that come during these cycles draw more oxygen into the blood, while the slower periods allow carbon dioxide to build slightly, triggering the next deep breath. Most people never notice this happening, but it contributes to that sense of waking refreshed and clear-headed that mountain sleep provides, as if the night has somehow cleaned and reorganized the mind. In the darkest hour before dawn, a subtle shift begins, though we might not yet perceive it. The fog, responding to temperature, changes too slight for human senses to detect, begins to stratify lighter wisps rising while heavier layers sink into the valleys below. The Alpine guides call this Nebelschichtung fog layering, and it's the first sign that night is loosening its grip, that the cycle is turning once more toward light. But this process unfolds so slowly, so gradually, that it belongs to the realm of the mountain's time rather than human time, measured in the settling of air masses and the infinitesimal warming that precedes the sun. There's a word in the old mountain dialects, Huttenfrieden, cabin peace. It's more than just quiet or tranquility. It's a state of deep reconciliation with the present moment. A sense that everything necessary is here, everything superfluous has fallen away. In this hour of deepest night, wrapped in fog and darkness, with the fire burning low and sleep hovering close, we touch this peace. The mountain asks nothing of us except that we'd be here, warm and safe, breathing in rhythm with the cabin's own breath. The complexity of the world below, its demands and urgencies and endless noise seems not just distant, but somehow unreal, a dream from which we've temporarily awakened into this simpler, truer existence. As this segment closes, we rest in the cabin's keeping, trusting to the thick walls and the patient fire, to the fog's protective embrace and the mountain's ancient strength. The night holds us gently, and we surrender to its holding, knowing that dawn will come in its own time, that the fog will lift or it won't, that the fire will burn through till morning, or will wake to build it anew. All of this is as it should be, as it has been for centuries, as it will be for centuries yet to come. The cabin endures, and in its endurance we find our own small piece of eternity. The night begins its slow transformation now, though the darkness remains complete and the fog shows no sign of lifting. Yet something has shifted, a quality in the stillness, a sense of the world gathering itself for the turn toward dawn. This is the hour the old mountain people called Zwischenstand, the between time when night is no longer deepening but not yet retreating. A liminal space where the cabin seems to exist outside the normal flow of hours. Let us consider the remarkable properties of the wood that surrounds us. Swiss stone pine, the favored timber for the finest cabin interiors, contains over 60 aromatic compounds, primarily sesquiterpenes and lignans, that are released slowly over decades, even centuries of the wood's life. Scientific studies conducted in Austrian research stations have shown that sleeping in a room lined with stone pine reduces heart rate by an average of 3,500 beats per night compared to other woods. This isn't folklore or wishful thinking. It's measurable physiology. The wood quite literally calms the human nervous system, creating an environment where stress hormones decrease and restorative sleep deepens. Those who built these cabins centuries ago couldn't measure heart rates, but they knew through generations of experience that stone pine brought peace. In the hours before dawn, the stove enters what heating masters call its Nachtglut phase, the afterglow period. The ceramic tiles, having absorbed heat for hours, now release it in a gentle, consistent radiation that requires no new fuel. A well-built stove at this stage is neither hot nor cool, but maintains what physiologists identify as the optimal sleeping temperature, between 60 and 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Too warm and sleep becomes restless, too cold and the body expends energy maintaining core temperature. The stove, with no thermostatic control, no electronic sensors, achieves this balance through pure thermal mass and careful design technology, perfected 500 years ago, that modern systems still struggle to match. The fog beyond our walls has begun a subtle metamorphosis. At this hour, when the temperature differential between the saturated air and the frozen ground reaches its maximum, a process called advection begins. The fog doesn't simply sit in place but moves slowly, almost imperceptibly, as gravity pulls the denser, moisture-laden air downward into valleys and depressions. If you were to watch with time-lapse vision, you would see the fog flowing like a slow river, pouring down mountainsides, pooling in basins, moving with the patient inevitability of glaciers. The cabin, positioned on its carefully chosen site, never in a valley bottom where cold air gathers, but on a small rise or bench where drainage is good. It's above this flowing river of mist, an island of warmth in a sea of cold. There is an old tradition of Traumhol's dream wood practice where the final log placed on the fire before sleep was chosen not just for its burning properties but for the quality of dreams it might inspire. Stone pine was believed to bring dreams of clarity and insight. Larch, with its distinctive resin, was said to produce vivid, colorful dreams. Beech brought dreamless, deep rest. Whether these beliefs held any truth beyond the power of suggestion hardly matters. What's significant is the attention paid to every detail of mountain life. The sense that even dreams could be tended and nurtured like a garden. That the choice of wood was a choice about the quality of one's inner life. In the darkest corner of the cabin, where firelight barely reaches, the temperature is several degrees cooler than near the stover gradient that serves an important purpose. Traditional cabin dwellers use this variation deliberately, hanging meat in the coolest corners for preservation, storing root vegetables where they wouldn't freeze but would remain dormant, placing milk pails where they'd stay cool but not turn to ice. The cabin wasn't a uniformly heated box, but a landscape of microclimates, each zone useful for different purposes. This variation also affected human comfort. One could move closer to or farther from the stove depending on one's needs, making the cabin infinitely adjustable without any mechanical controls. The practice of Fensterhirchen window listening belongs to these pre-dawn hours. In the time before weather forecasts, mountain dwellers would wake in the deep night and listen at the windows, not opening them, but pressing an ear to the cold glass or the wooden shutters. They could tell, by the quality of silence or sound, what the weather was doing. The absolute quiet of falling snow, the whisper of wind-driven sleet, the peculiar stillness of dense fog, the distant rumble of rocks loosened by freeze-thaw cycles. This wasn't superstition, but refined sensory awareness, the kind that develops when survival depends on reading subtle signs, when the mountain's moods must be understood and respected. In these hours, the human body undergoes its deepest healing and restoration. During what sleep researchers call slow-wave sleep, which peaks in the hours before dawn, the brain consolidates memories, processes emotions, and clears metabolic waste products that accumulate during waking hours. The combination of altitude, the negative ions produced by the wood fire, the aromatic compounds from stone pine, and the gentle, consistent warmth creates nearly ideal conditions for this restorative process. People often report that a single night in a mountain cabin feels like 3 nights of normal sleep, not because they sleep longer, but because they sleep more efficiently, passing through the necessary cycles with unusual completeness. There's a phenomenon that occurs only on the stillest, coldest nights, called Holstum, the voice of wood. As temperatures drop to their minimum just before dawn, the massive beams and planks contract slightly, and occasionally one will release a sharp crack, like a rifle shot in the silence. This sound, startling if you're not accustomed to it, isn't a sign of damage, but simply the wood responding to stress, finding a new equilibrium. Old-timers could identify which beam had spoken, and they'd nod in the darkness, acknowledging the cabin's voice, reassured rather than alarmed. The cabin wasn't silent and inert, but alive, speaking in its own language, participating in the night. As we conclude this passage through the pre-dawn hours, we rest in a darkness that has become familiar, almost friendly. The fog wraps the cabin in its cool embrace. The stove radiates its patient warmth. The wooden walls creak and settle, finding their balance in the cold. We float in that space between waking and dreaming, neither fully conscious nor fully asleep, held in the cabin's ancient arms like children in the arms of a patient grandmother who has sheltered countless generations before us and will shelter countless more after we've gone. The mountain endures, the fog flows, the fire glows, and we, for this brief moment, are home. The hour before dawn brings with it a peculiar quality of anticipation, though the darkness outside remains absolute and the fog gives no indication of the transformation that approaches. If you were to wake now, and mountain dwellers often do, attuned to rhythms deeper than those marked by clocks, you would sense rather than see the change, a subtle alteration in the texture of the night itself. This is what Alpine guides call Morgen's panning morning tension, the moment when night holds its breath before releasing into day. The foundation beneath our cabin tells a story of engineering wisdom that modern builders are only beginning to reappreciate. Traditional mountain cabins were never built directly on the ground, but elevated on a system of flat stones called Unterlagstein foundation stones. These weren't mortared or cemented, but simply placed with extraordinary care, each one positioned to distribute the cabin's weight evenly while allowing air to circulate beneath the floor. This elevation served multiple purposes. It prevented ground moisture from wicking into the wooden structure. It created a buffer zone where snow could accumulate without touching the walls. And crucially, it allowed the cabin to shift and settle with the freeze-thaw cycles of mountain soil without cracking or twisting. A cabin on such foundations could last 500 years in terrain where a modern concrete foundation might fail within 50. As the fire burns lower, entering what the old stove tenders called morgenlut, morning ember, the quality of heat changes. The ceramic tiles, which have absorbed warmth all night, now release it in long, slow waves, creating a heat that penetrates differently than flame heat. The fog outside has reached a critical moment in its nightly cycle. Just before dawn, when the temperature difference between the ground and the air above it is greatest. Fog can become ground fog layer, sometimes only 6 or 8 feet deep, beneath which the air is relatively clear. If you were to climb a ladder at this hour, your head might emerge above the fog into clear, starlit air while your feet remained in the murk. This radiant warmth doesn't heat the air directly, but warms surfaces, walls, floors, and human bodies, which in turn warm the surrounding air. The result is a more even, comfortable heat distribution than forced air systems can achieve. People often describe feeling warm from the inside out, as if the heat soaks into the bones rather than simply touching the skin. This is the principle of Strong's warm, radiant warms, and it's why those who've experienced it often find conventional heating systems unsatisfying ever after. Mountain hunters knew this phenomenon well and used it to their advantage, climbing to elevated positions where they could see while remaining hidden below. The cabin, built at its strategic elevation, often sits just above this ground layer, positioned perfectly to emerge into the first light while the valleys below remain drowned in white. There's a practice that belongs to these early hours called offenwecken, the waking of the stove. The first person to rise, traditionally the eldest woman of the household, would approach the stove in the darkness and place her hand on the tiles, feeling for warmth, listening for the tick of cooling metal. If coal still glowed beneath the ash, she would add small pieces of kindling, carefully arranged to catch without smothering the existing heat. If the fire had died completely, she would clean the firebox and begin anew. This wasn't merely a chore, but a ritual, a conversation with the element that sustained life. The stove wasn't a machine, but a partner, and tending it was an act of relationship rather than maintenance. In the stillness, you might hear a sound that's become increasingly rare in the modern world: true silence. Not the absence of noise, for the cabin has its creaks and whispers, but the absence of mechanical sound. No refrigerator hum, no electrical buzz, no distant traffic or aircraft. Researchers studying acoustic ecology have found that exposure to such deep quiet, even for a single night, can lower cortisol levels and reduce markers of chronic stress for days afterward. The human nervous system, it seems, craves silence the way the body craves water, and the cabin provides what the lowland world has almost entirely lost: the chance to hear the sound of one's own heartbeat, one's own breath, the small noises of the body itself moving through space. The wooden ceiling above our heads serves a function that's easy to overlook. In traditional construction, the Bretter deck plank ceiling was installed with small gaps between boards, gaps that appear to be flaws, but are actually intentional. These gaps allow moisture from cooking, breathing, and living to escape upward into the attic space, where it can ventilate away rather than condensing on cold surfaces and causing rot. The attic itself, filled with loose hay, or later with wool insulation, breathes with the seasons, expanding when warm, settling when cold, creating a dynamic insulation system that adjusts itself automatically. The cabin, in this sense, is more like a living organism than a static structure, self-regulating, responsive, intelligent, in ways that have nothing to do with electronics or sensors. As dawn approaches more closely, a phenomenon occurs that mountain meteorologists call thermal stirring. The first hints of warming, so slight that thermometers barely register them, begin to disturb the stable. Air masses that have settled during the night, the fog starts to move in subtle currents, not yet lifting but beginning to circulate, preparing for the transformation that sunlight will bring. Inside the cabin, we remain unaware of these movements, cocooned in our wooden sanctuary, but the mountain is already waking, shifting from the stillness of night into the activity of day. There's an old saying in the Alpine regions: "Die hat jibbed was du bringst, the cabin gives what you bring." This isn't mysticism, but practical wisdom. A cabin is only as warm as the wood you've gathered, only as comfortable as the preparations you've made, only as welcoming as the care you've invested. But there's a deeper meaning too. The cabin reflects your state of mind back to you. Approach it with anxiety and you'll find things to worry about: the wind in the eaves, the creaking beams, the pressing darkness. Approach it with peace, and it becomes a sanctuary beyond compare. The cabin is neutral. It amplifies what we bring to it, teaching us that comfort and fear alike originate not in circumstances but in ourselves. As this segment draws to a close, we rest in the final hour of darkness, that precious time when night still holds but day approaches, when the fog wraps close but light is gathering beyond the horizon. The stove radiates its last stored warmth. The wooden walls stand firm against the cold, and we, sheltered and safe, wait for the dawn that will transform everything: the fog into gold, the darkness into clarity, the night's mystery into morning's revelation. But that transformation still waits ahead. For now we remain in the embrace of darkness, grateful for the shelter, thankful for the warmth, content in this moment of suspended time between what was and what will be. The first indication of approaching dawn comes not through sight, but through sound, or rather, through a change in the quality of silence. The absolute stillness that characterized the deepest night begins to fracture, broken by the first tentative stirrings of life. A pine cone drops from a frost-laden branch somewhere in the invisible forest. A raven, somewhere above the fog, releases a single call that echoes strangely in the saturated air. These small sounds mark the boundary between night and morning, the threshold that mountain folk called Dammerungswell, the twilight threshold. The light, when it first appears, doesn't come from any visible source but seems to emanate from the fog itself. This is the phenomenon called diffuse dawn, where sunlight, still below the horizon, scatters through millions of suspended water droplets, turning the fog from black to grey to a luminous pearl white. This transformation happens so gradually that you cannot point to the moment of change. One moment you're in darkness, and then, without transition, you can identify you're in light. It's a lesson in patience, this dawn, a reminder that the most profound changes often happen too slowly to observe, becoming apparent only when they're complete. Inside the cabin, the stove has cooled to the point where its surface can be touched without discomfort. Yet it continues to radiate warmth, a testament to the thermal mass principle that governs all fine ceramic stove design. The tiles, some of them 4 inches thick, have stored so much energy over the night that they'll continue giving heat for hours yet, even with no fire at all. There's a mathematical elegance to this. A well-designed stove releases approximately 2/3 of the wood's energy as radiant heat over an extended period, while an open fireplace releases most of its energy immediately up the chimney, heating the sky more than the room. The efficiency difference is profound. A ceramic stove can heat a cabin with 1/3 the wood an open hearth requires. As light increases, the cabin's interior begins to reveal itself in a new way. The honey-colored wood that looked golden by firelight now shows its true character, the fine grain of ancient pine, the slight variations in color where heartwood meets sapwood, the subtle darkening around knots where resin has concentrated over decades. Each plank is unique, a record of the tree's life-lean years, visible as tight growth rings, prosperous years as wider bands. Reading these patterns, the old woodworkers could tell you not just what tree produced the wood, but what slope it grew on, what weather patterns shaped it, even approximately what decade it fell. The wood isn't just material, it's memory made solid. The fog outside begins its morning transformation, a process called nebulaflussing fog dissolution. As the sun rises, even though we cannot yet see it directly, it warms the upper layers of fog, making them lighter and causing them to rise. This creates a curious inversion, where the fog doesn't thin from the bottom up, as you might expect, but from the top down. The result is often a lowering cloud ceiling, with clear air appearing first at ground level while the fog persists above. From inside the cabin, watching through the small windows, this creates the impression of curtains being drawn. the world being slowly revealed as the fog lifts like a veil being raised on a stage. There is a ritual that belonged to this hour, practiced in mountain cabins for generations, called Morgan Warsome morning water. The first task after waking was to fetch fresh water from the spring or stream, breaking through ice if necessary, bringing the mountain's cold clarity into the warm cabin. This water, touched by first light but not yet warmed by the sun, was considered to have special properties, more refreshing, more alive somehow than water drawn later in the day. Modern hydrologists might scoff, noting that water's chemical composition doesn't change with the hour, but they'd miss the point. The ritual wasn't about the water's chemistry, but about the act itself, stepping into the cold morning, feeling the shock of mountain air, returning to warmth with something essential carried in your hands. It was a daily reminder of dependence and abundance, both of what the mountain provides and what we must work to obtain. As the cabin grows lighter, details emerge that were invisible in the firelight. The wear patterns on the floor near the stove where generations of feet have walked the same path. The slight darkening of wood around door handles, polished by countless hands. The small shelf carved into a beam where someone, decades or centuries ago, decided a particular spot needed a place to set a candle. These aren't just signs of age, but evidence of Gebrock Spatian, the patina of use equality that cannot be manufactured or faked, that only accumulates through years of human interaction with objects. Modern design often prizes the pristine, the unmarked, the new, but in a mountain cabin, these wear patterns are valued as proof of utility, evidence that the cabin has fulfilled its purpose across time. The temperature inside the cabin has reached its minimum, for the cycle usually occurring about an hour after dawn, but this minimum is still comfortable, still well above freezing, maintained by the stove's residual heat and the cabin's excellent insulation. The thick walls, often 18 inches of solid wood or more, have their own thermal mass, storing warmth during the evening and releasing it slowly through the night, combined with the stove's radiation. This creates what engineers call a thermal flywheel effector, resistance to temperature change that keeps the cabin's interior remarkably stable, regardless of what's happening outside. While the exterior air might swing 40 degrees between day and night, the cabin's interior might vary by only 10. There's a quality of light at mountain dawn that painters have tried for centuries to capture and always failed. It has to do with the clarity of high-altitude air, the way moisture and fog filter and soften it, the angle at which it strikes the landscape. The Germans call it Alpine glow, though that term usually refers to the pink light on peaks at sunset. But there is a morning equivalent, unnamed in any language, when everything seems to glow from within, the fog luminous and alive. The wooden walls of the cabin warm and golden, even the stones of the hearth seeming to hold some internal light. Last perhaps 15 minutes, this magical illumination, and then it's gone, replaced by ordinary daylight. But in those minutes, the world seems transfigured, as if you're seeing not just what is, but what could be beauty at its most essential and pure. As we reach the end of the segment, the cabin stands revealed in the growing light solid, patient, enduring. The fog still clings to the windows, but it's thinning now, its grip loosening. The stove ticks softly as metal contracts in the cooling air. And we, having passed through the complete cycle of night, prepare to meet the day that's been approaching all along, inevitable as season, certain as dawn. The cabin has done its work, sheltering us through darkness, keeping us warm, holding us safe. Now it prepares to show us what the morning brings, what the lifting fog will reveal, what gifts this new day in the mountains holds. The fog begins its final retreat now, and with it comes one of the mountain's most spectacular gifts. As the vapor lifts and thins, it doesn't simply disappear, but transforms, catching the strengthening sunlight and turning to gold. This phenomenon, which mountaineers call golden nebel golden fog, lasts only minutes, but in those minutes the world becomes incandescent, every droplet of moisture a tiny prism scattering light. From inside the cabin, watching through windows that have kept vigil all night, we witness this alchemy base element transformed into something precious. The ordinary made extraordinary through nothing more than light and angle and the patient passage of time. As the view clears, the landscape reveals itself piece by piece, like a painting emerging under an artist's hand. First, the nearest trees materialize, their branches heavy with rime ice that's accumulated through the night, each needle and twig encased in crystal. The entire forest transformed into glass sculpture. This ice formation, called Rohrraff in German, occurs when supercooled fog droplets freeze instantly upon contact with surfaces colder than 32 degrees. The result is a fairyland landscape, delicate and temporary, existing only in these brief hours before the sun's warmth causes it to fall away in glittering showers. It's a reminder that the most beautiful things are often the most fleeting, that impermanence itself is part of what makes beauty precious. The hearth, now cool enough to touch, still holds the story of last night's fire in its bed of ash and ember. There's an old mountain practice called Ashen Weierscheid Tash Wisdom. The reading of fires remains to understand how well the wood burned, how efficiently heat was extracted, what adjustments might improve tomorrow's fire. White ash indicates complete combustion, good wood, proper airflow. Black chunks of charcoal suggest too little oxygen or green wood. The arrangement of what remains tells you about the fire's progression through the night, whether it burned too fast or held too long. This wasn't mere housekeeping, but a form of feedback, a conversation between fire tender and flame that improved with each iteration. Each night's fire informed by the lessons of the last. Beyond the cabin, as visibility extends, the true scale of the landscape begins to assert itself. Mountain peaks emerge from the dissipating fog like islands rising from the sea, their summits already touched by direct sunlight, while the valleys remain in shadow. This is the moment called Gipfellucht Peak illumination, when the highest points catch fire with light while everything below still slumbers in blue-gray dawn. The effect is dramatic, almost spiritual, and it explains why so many cultures located their sacred sites on mountain tops, why heights have always been associated with the divine. There's something about seeing land emerge from obscurity into light that speaks to fundamental human longings for clarity, for revelation, for the lifting of veils. Inside our cabin, the temperature begins its slow rise as the day takes hold. But unlike modern heated spaces where temperature change is abrupt and mechanical, the cabin warms gradually, organically, responding to the sun's influence and the residual heat still stored in its massive timbers and stone. This gentle warming is part of what makes mountain cabin life so harmonious with human physiology. There are no sudden shocks, no jarring transitions, just slow, natural cycles that the body can anticipate and adjust to. Studies of circadian rhythms have shown that gradual temperature changes, like those in a traditional cabin, help regulate sleep-wake cycles more effectively than the constant temperatures of modern buildings, where the body loses important environmental cues. There's a breakfast tradition in Alpine cabins called Bergfrauer Stuck Mountain Breakfast that's less about what you eat than how you eat it. The morning meal is taken slowly, mindfully, often in silence or quiet conversation, while watching the day establish itself beyond the windows. There's no rushing, no multitasking, no eating while doing something else. The food typically simple: bread, cheese, perhaps some cold meat or preserves is appreciated fully, each bite savored, because at this altitude, after this night, even simple food tastes profound. The act of eating becomes a meditation, a gratitude practice, an acknowledgement that sustenance itself is worthy of attention and respect. As full daylight arrives, the cabin's relationship with the landscape shifts. During the night, it was a refuge, a barrier between us and the mountain's severity. But now, with light flooding through the windows and the fog dispersed, the cabin becomes a frame, a viewing platform, a lens through which to observe and appreciate the wilderness. The small windows, which seemed limiting in darkness, now perfectly compose the view, each one a carefully cropped vista, nature presented with the selectivity of art. This is the genius of traditional cabin design. It doesn't try to erase the boundary between inside and outside, but rather honors that boundary, making the transition between shelter and wilderness deliberate and meaningful. The door of the cabin, which has remained closed through the long night, now invites opening. Stepping outside into the mountain morning is like entering cold water, shocking at first, then invigorating, then utterly wonderful. The air at this altitude, this time of day, has a quality that's impossible to describe to those who haven't experienced it. Crystalline, sharp, almost effortlessly breathable despite its reduced oxygen content. It smells of pine resin and stone, of snow and space and distance. Drawing this air into your lungs, you understand why mountain peoples have always been described as hardy, why altitude is associated with clarity of thought and strength of spirit. The environment demands something from you, but what it gives in return is immeasurable. There's a final tradition worth mentioning, one that brings our journey full circle. It's called Huttenabschied, cabin farewell. Before leaving a mountain cabin, even if you plan to return tomorrow, you perform a small ritual of gratitude and preparation. You clean the hearth and stack wood for the next fire. You straighten what's been displaced. You stand for a moment in the main room and simply acknowledge the shelter you've received. Then, before stepping out the door, you place your hand on the wood door frame wall. Whatever is closest, and offer thanks. Not to any deity necessarily, but to the cabin itself, to the trees that became its walls, to the builders who raised it, to all who've sheltered here before you and all who will after. This gesture, taking only seconds, transforms the cabin from mere accommodation into something sacred, a participant in your journey rather than a passive backdrop. As our 100 facts draw to their close, we stand at the threshold, 1 foot still inside the warmths, 1 foot already in the bright, cold morning. Behind us, the cabin rests, patient and enduring, ready to begin its cycle again when darkness returns. The stove waits for the next fire. The walls stand ready to shelter the next traveler. The fog will gather again with evening, and the mountain night will fall once more, and someone else will find refuge here, as we did, as countless others have before. This is the final wisdom the mountain cabin offers, that some things endure. In a world of constant change, where nothing seems permanent and everything is disposable, these sanctuaries of wood and stone remind us that humans have always needed shelter, warmth, safety, that the fundamental requirements of existence don't change, even as everything around them transforms, that there is profound comfort in continuity, in knowing that the fire you build tonight echoes fires built 1,000 years ago, that the walls around you have protected generations before you and will protect generations yet to come. The fog has lifted now, burned away by strengthening sun. The peaks stand clear against a sky of impossible blue. The cabin behind us glows golden in the morning light. Smoke no longer rising from its chimney, but its presence as solid and reassuring as the mountain itself. We carry with us now more than memories. We carry the knowledge that such places exist, that refuge is real, that in the high country where earth meets sky, humans have created small pockets of warmth and light that endure against all odds. And perhaps that's the greatest gift of all, the reminder that we too can endure, that we too can create warmth in cold places, light in darkness, shelter in wilderness. The cabin teaches by example, standing firm through centuries of storms, holding its ground against wind and snow and time itself. It asks nothing of us except that we appreciate what it offers, that we tend the fire while we're here, that we leave it ready for the next traveler. As we step fully into the mountain morning, closing the door behind us but carrying the cabin's warmth in our hearts, we know we'll return. Not to this specific cabin, perhaps, but to this experience, this combination of wood and fire and fog, of shelter and solitude and silence. Because once you've known the peace of a mountain cabin night, once you've watched fog press against small windows while fire transforms wood to warmth, once you've felt the deep contentment of being exactly where you need to be with exactly what you need to survive, you're changed. You carry that knowledge forward, that certainty that such peace exists and can be found again. The mountain stands eternal. The fog will return with evening. And somewhere in a valley high among the peaks, a cabin waits, patient as stone, warm as memory, enduring as hope itself.